We are continuing our study of 1 Samuel today. We're going to be taking a look at 1 Samuel 21, verses 10 through 15. And I want to start out this morning by telling you how much I love confrontation. It's something that just comes really naturally to me. I'm really good at being honest with people when I have a problem with them, and I especially enjoy when somebody has a problem with me and lets me know all about it. Obviously, I'm joking. Like many of you, I absolutely hate confrontation. When it comes to confrontation, most people have two responses, fight or flight. And I am most certainly a flight person. And I think a lot of you are that way as well. Confrontation is not something that comes naturally to me. It's not something that I do well. It makes me feel nervous. It makes me feel anxious. It can make me feel physically sick. I'll be honest with you and say that I am afraid of conflict. I am afraid of confrontation. I don't want people to be upset with me. I don't want people to think that I'm upset with them. Conflict is stressful, and it instills a strong desire to run away at all costs. When I was 7 years old, I got in trouble for some reason and got sent to my room. I don't remember what I did, but I'm sure I deserved the punishment. What I do remember is how I reacted to my mom and dad when they punished me. I told them that I was going to run away to Japan. That's right, Japan. What was going on in my mind? Well, I was probably 7 at the time. My mom had a former boss who had just moved to Ohio, and my 7-year-old mind somehow confused Ohio with Tokyo. So I told my mom and dad, I'm running away, and I'm running away to Japan. My point is that the conflict I had with my mom and dad caused me to run away to the degree that I literally wanted to go and live with my mom's former boss in Ohio, who I hardly knew. That's my response to conflict. I think it's safe to say that a lot of us have that same kind of response. We should probably talk about the fight response too at some point, but today we're just focusing in on the flight response. See, whether it's at home, work, church, or wherever else, conflict makes most of us feel uncomfortable. So we have a tendency to ignore it, to avoid it, or indeed to run away from it. If you're a fight person, you get aggressive and you want to prove your point. But what we see in today's scripture is David running from his conflict with Saul. Everything's come to a head up to this point as we have walked through 1 Samuel. We know that David's going to become king. God has removed that status, that role from Saul because of his disobedience, because of his faithlessness, because of his jealousy. And David has been anointed, but he has not been given that official role yet. So Saul is still king, and Saul is persecuting David. And Saul is going to rest at nothing until David is dead. And so we enter into a few chapters in which we see David fleeing from Saul. He ran away. Instead of dealing with the conflict, he went from city to city to city. And if you're following along with me today, as I said, we're going to be taking a look at verses 10 through 15. We see this pattern of David running away pick up here. Hear the word of God. David rose and fled that day from Saul. He went to King Achish of Gath. The servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of King Achish of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them. He pretended to be mad in their presence. He scratched marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. Maybe we should have a sermon sometime about acting crazy to get out of a bad situation. Achish said to his servants, "Look, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" Interesting passage. The key thing that I really want to emphasize about it today is that David is now running away from Saul. What happened at the end of the passage last week, the second half that we didn't study of 1 Samuel 20, we remember that David and Jonathan enter into a covenant of mutual protection. And so Jonathan goes and confronts Saul, and he figures out, yeah, absolutely, my dad is going to kill David. And we can understand why that would cause David to go on the run, right? If somebody threatened my life, I would run away too. David's life was in danger. And it's likely in my mind that there's little he could have done to have resolved this tension, little he could have said to assuage Saul's hatred. The damage was done. Saul's jealousy had reached its tipping point. Nothing short of David's death would have satiated him. But on the other hand, this isn't the only situation in which we see David running away. Again, we'll be taking a look at how David runs away in various other ways next week, namely how he runs away from his fear. That's something else that we deal with. But as we progress in the story of 1 Samuel, and then as we get into 2 Samuel, we see that this is a pattern in David's life. It was actually, I would say, one of his most significant flaws. And we see things come to a head. David's desire to run away from conflict come to a head in 2 Samuel. And we see what kinds of devastation this desire to run away from conflict can inevitably cause. It all started when David's oldest son, Amnon, raped David's daughter. And this was Amnon's half-sister. David had a lot of kids and a lot of different wives. So there's a lot of different connections within his family as you get into 2 Samuel. So Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. And then another one of David's sons, Absalom, who is Tamar's full brother, finds out what happens. And his hatred for his half-brother grew significant. But he doesn't do anything about it. Neither does David. David finds out what happens and he ignores the situation. 2 years pass. Everything seemed fine, but one day when Amnon and Absalom took a trip into the country together, Absalom got his brother drunk and ordered his servants to kill him. He murders his own brother to get revenge for what had happened to Tamar. It's clear that Absalom never forgave Amnon. He never forgot what had happened, nor did he forgive David for ignoring the conflict. It's clear from Absalom's point of view that David could have done something to punish Amnon, to make the situation right, to bring justice for what had happened to Tamar. But once Absalom finds out or figures out that David's going to just continue to ignore things, he takes matters into his own hands. And in fact, after murdering Amnon, he conspires against his own dad to take the throne. He wants to be king. And this results in a civil war in Israel, a bloody and tragic civil war pitting family against family. And what we see from that is David's desire to run away from conflict once again caused so much violence. It caused so much grief, so much destruction, all because he failed to confront an issue that, by all means, he should have confronted. And I think what this ultimately teaches us is that the destruction brought about by avoiding conflict is often many times worse than the unpleasantness that might result from dealing with the issue when it first arises. Let me say that a little bit differently. Unresolved conflicts never fade away. They have a tendency to breed even worse conflict, and as such, we need to confront our conflicts before they lead to worse problems. In David's case, we're obviously dealing with major issues, death threats, rape, murder, civil war. But in our case, a lot of the conflicts we experience in our day-to-day lives and in our relationships stem from an issue of a much less significant magnitude. You might find yourself annoyed by how your spouse puts the dishes in the dishwasher. You have a coworker that always speaks to you with a condescending or a harsh tone. You have that one friend who's always bringing up politics even when you have explicitly asked them not to. I think in some ways conflicts are a lot like illnesses. Minor ones might clear up over time. You get a cold, it clears up over time. Sometimes it could be a really minor conflict and it will heal on its own, but even if we ignore them, there are occasions when even the smallest of illnesses can become something much more significant and cause major problems if we allow them to work their way deeper and more catastrophically into our systems. A tooth abscess can cause sepsis. and sepsis can be fatal. Whatever the case may be, no matter how big or how small, there is always a chance that conflict will get worse if we don't confront it. I want to share with you today one of the ways that this has played out in my own life. Again, I never want to put my life on a pedestal to show you how much I have it right. I do it more so to show you how much I have wrong and how much I am in the process of learning what it means to follow Jesus faithfully. And so I want to share with you a little bit more about my marriage. I know that this has been an illustration I've been using a lot in the past several weeks, but it's an important place for me to reflect on these issues. And so I would say that Krista and I do have a very healthy and happy marriage, but she would agree with me on this. There is no such thing as a happy or healthy marriage, or any relationship for that matter, that occurs automatically. That doesn't just happen overnight. It takes a lot of work, a lot of honesty, a lot of courage for Kristen and I to mutually acknowledge, to confront, and resolve our problems. There's no such thing as a perfect marriage, right? It doesn't exist. At least I have yet to see one that exists. It takes a lot of humility to admit when we've hurt each other, a lot of grace to forgive each other. And for us, it sounds so stupid saying this out loud, but one source of conflict in our marriage will always be the cleanliness of our house. That's a small issue, right? On paper, it's a stupid issue in the scheme of things. I wish it wasn't a source of conflict, but it is. Here's the thing, Kristen and I are simply wired differently when it comes to cleaning, and we were raised in different households in this regard. My extended family on my dad's side like to always point out how obsessive-compulsive we Stuyvesant men are. And there's truth to that jest. I saw it in my grandpa when he was alive. I see it in my dad. My dad is, we joke with him that he's the kind of guy that after we're at his house, when we're at his house, he's following us around with a rag, cleaning up everything along the way. But I'm that same way. I criticize my dad, but I'm exactly that same way. My boys are like that too. I literally can't operate or think straight if our house is messy, disorganized, or cluttered. Krista, on the other hand, isn't bothered whatsoever by messiness. Sometimes I think she actually thrives the messier it is. I told her the other night that I was going to point out that when we first got married, that she liked to live in piles of paper, piles of clothes, piles of dishes. I said, I removed that joke from my sermon because I didn't think it was flattering. She said, no, leave it, it's funny. Didn't take long for us to realize how big of a problem this would be after we got married. And here's where things get problematic for us. Neither one of us is confrontational. We're both really passive-aggressive. Thus, I would frequently, and I still do, this is not a resolved issue by any means, I find myself frustrated that Krista doesn't clean in the way that I want her to. But on the other hand, she often feels herself feeling inadequate, that nothing she does is enough to please me. And since neither one of us is honest or transparent about how we feel, the tension between us just gets worse. And when that happens, what do? You bottle up all that tension. When you don't have a way of addressing it relationally, you bottle it up and keep it inside. And here's the thing. I have an Instant Pot. I know how that thing works. When the pressure builds up, it needs somewhere to go. I wouldn't go so far as to say that either one of us ever blows up at each other. We've never had a yelling fight in our relationship, but there have certainly been moments throughout the course of our marriage where our inability to confront one another about issues surrounding something small like house chores has occasionally caused other, more significant problems to develop. We're at a place now where we can recognize this about our relationship. We've been able to work on things intentionally. But as I said earlier, that's not something that has happened automatically. We've had to recognize that there's a conflict here in our relationship, and we've had to confront it together. And while we're still definitely a work in progress, I think that we've made some important strides, especially over the past few years. Finally, after 10 years of marriage, we have found methods to help us deal with conflict in healthy ways. And please note, the key word there is deal. Actually deal with the conflict, not ignore, not avoid, not run away from, not lash out at. In order to experience health in any of our relationships in the manner that God designed us to, we have to be willing to confront issues. Because, as I said earlier, the destruction brought about by avoiding conflict is often many times worse than the unpleasantness that might have resulted from dealing with the issues when they first arise. That's a mouthful. To shorten it, once again, deal with your issues when they first come up. Otherwise, they might get a lot more serious. See, there is no such thing as a conflict-less relationship. Conflict is part and parcel of what it means to live in a world that has been so ravaged by the power of sin. There's no question about whether or not we will experience conflict, even within our relationships with those whom we are most close with. The question we have to ask, rather than whether or not we deal with conflict, is how do we deal with our conflicts, our disagreements and our arguments in healthy ways? How can we be agents of reconciliation within our relationships? And so with all of that being said, I want to give you a few tips this morning. I don't typically give you a list of tips to follow, but I felt that it was fitting to do that today. Tips that I have learned either in my own relationships, things that I've found biblically or theologically, things that I've picked up in pastoring classes, counseling classes, psychology classes. Last week we talked about fostering intimacy within our relationships, and I offer you these tips in hopes that they will help you to that end, to foster intimacy with those whom you love and care about. So, 7 tips to help you deal with conflict, to help you confront conflict. Number 1, remind yourself that your relationship is worth the discomfort of facing the conflict and resolving your issues. Why do we run away from conflict in the first place? Because it's scary, because it is uncomfortable. But your relationship with that person is likely more important than the discomfort, so just deal with it. Enter into that unpleasant place momentarily so that in the long term, your relationship can heal. Things can get much, much worse, as I've been saying, if you don't face your conflicts. Think about the analogy of a minor health issue again. If left untreated, a tooth absence can develop into full-blown sepsis and can kill somebody. A small tooth infection can be fatal. So getting that treated, typically with a tooth abscess, either getting it popped or getting the tooth removed, goes a long way to healing a person's health, no matter how much it hurts to get the shot in your gums to deal with the extraction. That is beneficial for your long-term health. Number 2, pick your battles wisely. Some hills aren't worth dying on. Some hills are worth dying on. When I think of that, I think of Jesus, because if anyone had the right to confront an issue, it was Jesus, right? He was perfect, yet despite what we would think, he didn't waste his time trying to right every single wrong in this world. Amazingly, some of the things that we think he should have addressed, he didn't, while other things that we never would have noticed, he challenged head on. Pick your battles. Fight cleanly, fight wisely. We'll talk about fighting cleanly here in a minute. Pick your battles wisely. I think that raises this question, how do we know which battles are worth fighting and which ones aren't? That brings up point number 3, pray about it. Ask God what he wants from you in the situation, and especially how he wants that situation to heal. Number 4, create a loving environment for open communication. As Krista and I have worked through our issues, one of the things that has come to the surface is that Krista often feels like she can't confront me because, guess what? In addition to being passive-aggressive, I'm also really defensive. So she says, you hurt me by the way you asked me to sweep the floor, and I'll say, I didn't hurt you. Maybe not quite in that tone, but you get the point. I'm defensive. I don't like having my flaws pointed out. That, too, is uncomfortable. Well, it's something I recognize about myself now, especially when it comes to her, so I'm able to put my guard down now. I'm intentional about coming to a situation, and I think to myself, okay, she's not attacking me. She's trying to fix something. So I let my guard down, and because of that, I'm able to be more intentional about listening to her with attentiveness, with grace, and with care. Your relationship should be a place of acceptance, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a friendship, a relationship with your kids, a relationship with your pastor. We should all be striving to help one another live better lives. Number 5, maintain a calm and respectful demeanor during heated conversations. I've been in enough counseling classes or counseling seminars in my life to know that fighting fairly is really important. It's not that we don't have fights in our relationships, it's that there are certain unwritten rules that we need to follow when we're in a conflict. Chris and I have worked through our issues, as I have said again and again and again. And one of the things that comes up within that is that confrontation can bring up difficult emotions. And if that happens, I would encourage you, don't cross the line by retaliating. Again, my defensiveness. Krista will say, you hurt me in this way. You know what my mind does? I have an awful way of thinking back to something she did like 12 years ago and saying, okay, so you're mad at me for the way I talked to you about cleaning the floor, but what about this you did before we were even married? Remember that? Remember how you hurt me then? That's not fair. That's not the issue at hand. That's a completely different issue. You fight fairly by keeping the focus on the dispute at hand and don't bring personal jibes or put-downs into the conversation. Deal with the issue, not the person. Number 6, get to the root of the problem. For us, I would say at this point in my life, cleaning is not actually the root of the issue. For me, it's an issue of respect. I feel disrespected when the house isn't clean the way I like it. For Krista, it's an issue of feeling that I'm too controlling, that she has her own personality and her own way of doing things. I can't tell you how beneficial with this single issue, this issue of cleaning the house, how beneficial it has been for us to get to the root of the problem and deal with that instead of cleaning house. Once we were able to work through that, there was a lot of healing that took place. And number 7, some of you might not like this because some of you aren't wired to be compromisers. In fact, a lot of personality tests will point out whether or not you're a compromiser. This doesn't come naturally to all of us, but I'm a compromiser. And I think that it is so important when it comes to confrontation to find balance between what both people want and are comfortable with. If you care about making the relationship work, you will come to an agreement on things without feeling like you're making huge sacrifices for your relationship. Compromising is key, in my mind, to resolving conflicts. And finding a middle ground oftentimes is easier than you might think it is. Relationships take a give and take, right? They require that give and take. And when it comes to our home, I've realized that there is no such thing as a home that is clean 100% of the time, especially when you have 2 young boys living in the house. I've also learned to embrace the mess and to be grateful for Krista when she cleans, even if it's not the way that I would do things. Krista has learned from her end of things how much the uncleanliness bothers me. And while she'll never be able to completely understand things from my point of view, she cares enough about me that she does her best to tidy up to my standards. Yes, there is conflict in this fallen world, even with the ones we love most, our friends, our colleagues. The way that we approach the problem ultimately makes all of the difference in the world. We can run away from it, we can get super aggressive, but in the end, that just causes more problems along the way. My pastoral advice to you, my advice to you as a friend, as a brother in Christ, rather than running away from the problem, I would encourage you to deal with it head on in a loving way, of course, and thus begin the process of healing and reconciliation.